Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to New Books in Politics and Polemics, a channel on the New Books Network. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Megu. I also host my own podcasts, Independent Thought and Freedom, and also a story club, Global Politics and Global Cultures. The link is in the sidebar of the NBN website. Today, my guest is Michael Thompson, co-editor of An Inheritance for Our Times, Principle and Politics of Democratic Socialism, edited along with Gregory Smulewicz-Zucker, published by OR Books this year in 2020. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Kirk, for having me.
All right. By the way, where are you joining us from?
I live in New York City.
Okay, great. And I'm from Trinidad and Tobago here, so I look forward to interesting conversation.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, particularly as it relates to the book?
Well, I'm a political theorist, political philosopher by training, but my interest in this topic, in particular, questions about social justice and socialism in particular, go back to when I was actually young. I come from a working class background, union background, and started working in warehouses and when I was about 13, and was enculturated into the kind of union movement as a young worker, and found that this really was a kind of transformative experience for me, because it opened up a kind of world of a new way of kind of relating to others. It was kind of a world of solidarity, a world of equality, a world of concern with principle and human dignity. And this was something that was in stark contrast to the culture that I lived in outside of work.
And where was that, if you don't mind?
This was in right outside of New York City in northeastern New Jersey, kind of in Paterson, New Jersey.
Right.
Where I was born and grew up. And this was in the late 1980s and 1990s. So the culture, in a lot of ways, was, for someone who was a teenager, especially in those decades, was really just fraught with alienation and a kind of sense of purposelessness to the world. I guess it's kind of the result of the kind of Reagan, Thatcher, neoliberal kind of 1980s. So we were growing up in the ashes of that, the cultural detritus, I guess, that neoliberal capitalism had produced. And one of the things that I found fascinating about when I was young about this was that it transformed what the nature of work meant. That I was working here, in a produce warehouse, kind of shipping boxes around in cold weather, hot weather, moving garbage and doing all these things. And but it gave dignity to the idea of work, the idea of labor. Right. And that was really significant.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's really interesting. Because there's a lot of critique of the current SJW movement as being elitist, out of touch, and whatnot. Now, you are coming from a working class background, and in the 1980s and 90s, well, in the 1980s and 90s, I think the seeds of what's happening today were definitely there, but how does your experience with the union movement and that very concrete, real social movement and organization, etc., contrast with the movements of today? Because it's interesting. I in looking through the book, I see. I can't remember if it's from your essay, but from another essay. There was a phrase saying that, essentially, if I paraphrase it, that not all populist movements are emancipatory or are socialist or should be
Right.
embraced, for example, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and then you had, I mean, and I guess I'd want you to fold into that. I'd be very interested about, your experience there in New Jersey with, the Reagan working class, the Reagan Democrats, those working class people that felt the Democratic Party abandoned them, and you could, because that is very that has a lot of parallels with what's occurring today, with a lot of working class people feeling the Democratic Party has abandoned them as well. And I know I'm not equating the Democratic Party with democratic socialism, but just it's the general atmosphere, and I'm interested in your perspective coming from that background.
For me, one of the if I think about some of the first lessons I learned about what was attractive to the idea of being part of organized labor was that it taught me a couple of things about first about the nature of work, but it also taught me most importantly about the nature of authority and power, which was that um, the that lacking organization and also lacking the idea that there was a concrete entity that was seeking to exert power over you. Lacking that, your criticisms about your situation become diffuse and
Right.
abstract. On the other hand, what it also started to teach me was when you look more into the history of the labor movement, was that, and in particular, how exclusionary it was. This was not the reality that that my kind of experience reflected. I
Mm-hmm.
was part of a union movement where women and people who were non-white
Yeah.
were very integral, and it taught me the idea about the idea that the first letter I got received when I was kind of member of the union, paying union dues, um, was signed in solidarity, and it had the name of the union president on.
Mm-hmm.
And this was just something that, to me, as a young teenager, was very powerful because it was the idea that said, "Well, you know, I have common interests with people who don't look like me or don't come from a similar place or background as I
Yeah.
did." And so it taught not only about the nature of that kind of power, but the nature of a kind of equality that's needed if you're going to have that kind of power, if you're going to be able to cultivate a kind of counter authoritarian, counter domination type of power that's truly democratic. I think the problem that we're in now actually is that one of the powers of the labor movement historically has always been that it's been able to cultivate in its best moments those types of norms and attitudes, practices, um, and really give people a vision into another way of living, that it doesn't only have to be your union or your workplace, but the other parts of society should also be um, just as democratic as this space is. And I think with populist movements, what's been happening recently, first of all, as the left becomes less and less rooted in the labor movement,
Yeah.
it actually, I believe, is becoming more and more culturalist and actually a lot less potent as a political force.
Right.
And I think one of the things that's happening is, of course, I mean, if you think of what's happening now in particular, not only in the United States, but spreading around the world now, Black Lives Matter as an ethical movement. I mean, it's something that I embrace. It's something that I've been thinking about many decades
Yeah.
about how do you incorporate race into these questions. But the nature of the movement on a political level has been extremely abstract,
Right.
and in some cases immature. Because in a lot of ways, I think it's a similar problem to what you had with the New Left in the 1960s. The question of whether ethical insights or ethical projects can be translated into actual political projects. And the labor movement, one of the things that gave, I think, the labor movement and socialist movements when they were at their most robust, that power was only when they were able to, first of all, ward off the idea of trade unionism and the idea that this is about protecting wages and for us as a group,
Yeah.
and instead see it as part of a larger democratic enterprise about democratizing the rest of society. And also with the idea that said that class is one of the probably the most fundamental categories for explaining the patterns of domination that exist, even in those spaces that are not necessarily defined by class, such as gender and race. But I do think that something's happened since the 1980s and 90s also, which is that you've had an intellectual current starting with postmodernism and now moving on to, I guess, what you call a post-postmodernism,
Hmm.
um, that really grounds all politics in discourse, in culture, in the symbolic. And
Right.
that has really undermined the idea of class as a central category. And it's really allowed, I think it's allowed wealth and income inequality to get worse. It's allowed capitalism to get even more ferocious. But at the same time, it's been, uh, and at the same time, it's actually, I think, watered down and weakened the left.
That's interesting. And I uh, sympathize with a lot of what you say there. The idea of, I think the term you're using there is culturalist, that, the left has become more culturalist. Certainly, there have been observations made that a lot of what's going on right now in America resembles the Maoist cultural revolution. I don't know if you link the two at all in your thinking about this, but I do think that there is this kind of link there. Then that kind of alienates a lot of the actual real working class, and then I think contributes to the dilution that you were talking about of the left, and then also the co-optation of a lot of these liberation movement by neoliberal corporatism. And so you get Starbucks and McDonald's, the largest corporations in the world, backing SJW
Yeah.
projects, and I find that highly ironic, to say the least,
Yeah.
and sinister, to say the worst.
Mm-hmm.
What's your view on that?
Oh, I agree. Well, first, that it seems to me increasingly the case that um, um, any kind of this is one of the reasons that in our book we emphasized that we're talking about the concept of democratic socialism as a specific tradition that comes out of the worker movements of the 19th century, because the idea of democracy is so important, and not only democracy as a kind of what we say is democracy goes, but I think part of the problem is that um, when you enter into or evolve this kind of culturalist expression, um, you leave the idea that there is some universal set of values.
Right.
Right? So one of the things that was really forged in the 1980s and 90s as a kind of hard philosophical argument, which I think over the past 2 decades has become kind of petered out into the popular political consciousness, really comes from this idea that says all politics is perspectival. All politics. So the theory basically was that Marxism has collapsed.
Yeah.
There is no, there's no, that Marxist theory assumed in its most mechanistic sense that working people were involved in a system which made apparent to them this fundamental structure of domination undergirding the entirety of society, which was the relationship between working people and the owners of the means of production, capital and labor. And by the 1980s, the position had become, in left theory and philosophy, this
Like
model is
Laclau and
gone.
Mouffe.
Laclau
Yeah.
and Mouffe really
Yeah.
is really one of the turning points. So
Yeah.
so the question then becomes, how do you forge political subjectivity if this Marxian theory is no longer tenable? And you do this by you construct an identity of that in relation to some oppression, and it's my group or your group, and each one, and the terrain of politics is going to be each of us vying to get the respect and dignity that we have, that we're looking for. We're always going to be we're defined by the power that we're opposed, and this opens the door when linked with all these other culturalist concerns. This opens the door to I think a major problematic, which is you actually shatter the potentialities for solidarity with other people in terms of along concrete lines of power. And I think it's really, as bad as the Democratic Party has been in terms of moving toward the center, the real opportunism in North American politics has been the opportunism of the right, and the way the right has been able to basically coax and use race in particular and use these ideas against a more rational, progressive left, and it's working. Trump Trump can capture the imaginary of the working class because it is populism.
Mm-hmm.
It's authoritarian populism, but it's populism nonetheless. And all the stresses and strains, the cultural and economic and social stresses and strains, which should be diagnosed from the position of, that neoliberal capitalism has created this kind of, suck up society in terms of wealth and value to the top 1%, instead of that discourse taking the political imaginary over, you've got this kind of almost this fragmentation. And I can tell you from living in New York, when Occupy Wall Street, the kind of devolution of that movement here, that when it first started, unions and working groups and gay rights activists and racial equality activists and groups, everyone was coming together to to basically recognize that we've all been screwed over by this system of financialized capitalism. We've all been exploited. We've all been undermined, and manipulated in terms of our political ideas based on cultural attitudes and reactionary values. Everyone was able to come together on this, but it was only the devolution of that movement was only when class really ceased to be the centerpiece. So instead of seeing the system as a kind of totality where class was involved, where one class oppressing another class, it started to take on a kind of politics of the possible, which was more philosophical or theological than it was actually political. So there was no talk about, what kind of agenda, what kind of political, what actual demands do we have, rather than saying we're going to create this Zuccotti Park, this space where everyone can be free and people can just share things, and this kind of utopianism that has taken over. It's particularly with younger members of the left and of these movements. It just fizzled it out, honestly. And
Right.
I believe that you do need, and this is part of what I try to do in my essay, the idea that only class matters and the imagination doesn't, or only class matters and gender and race doesn't, is clearly, this is wrong. The only way to move forward from these problems, these kind of errors of judgment that have really taken place, is to find a kind of theoretical framework where you integrate the idea of the emancipation of the self, the emancipation of culture, questions of hardcore realism, which is questions of economism and material forms of power, but also questions of political justice and social inclusion. And up to now, the dominant paradigm for that in North America, at least North American and Anglo-Saxon societies, has been liberalism.
Right.
And liberalism has been co-opted by neoliberalism. So part of what democratic socialism must do is not simply talk about the 1%. These are really there's really no coherent set of ideas lurking behind a lot of what's out there on the internet, for example, or in some of these movements. I can tell you, reading a lot of this stuff, that it's there's just a real lack of knowledge of the tradition going forward, which is part of one of the reasons that we wanted to do this book, because to kind of try to piece together what a more robust democratic ideal looks like.
All right, that's interesting. I mean, a lot of points there that I want to talk about since you raised them now. And you had spoken, you had used the kind of opposition earlier about ethical versus political projects, which is an interesting distinction. And I think you elaborated a bit on it. And to me, it sounds like the old debate that even Marx had with the socialists, about utopianism versus what Marx considered practical. Um, I don't know if he called it practical communism, but for him, communism was a practical thing as opposed to the socialist utopianism. And I suppose, is that basically what you're talking about in the current context?
I think so. But if you
Yeah.
look at the debates that Marx and Engels are having in those years working up to when they write the Communist Manifesto, and you see what they're really up against. I mean, the most sophisticated of them, like Proudhon and stuff, is one thing.
Mm-hmm.
But they're really up against the kind of followers of Proudhon. They're these people who really didn't have a theory of society. They didn't really
Right.
know how things worked, and instead it was quasi-theological.
Right.
Everyone's brother, and you could see in these speeches that they would have given. I mean, no one would read this stuff today. It's completely useless. But Marx, the thing about Marx in particular is that he's also reading, and this is not as well known in the scholarship, but it's there. Marx is also reading North American radical writers that were writing from the 1820s through the 1850s,
Mm-hmm.
when there was a radical labor movement in the Northern American states.
Yeah.
And Marx is following these people, like Orestes Brownson's early writings, but also, John Pickering, a whole bunch of these, Theophilus Fiske, and they were really trying to come up with a theory of wages and how the banking system actually turns into a new. They were trying to show the economy as a branch of actual power. To say, look, the 18th century was a fight against concrete political power, against monarchy and against aristocracy, but it's just migrated into a new form. And this is what Marx took to the next level. And I think the idea that there is a separation between the ethical and political is a kind of false analytic distinction. You can get caught in the ethical by not understanding the needs of the political. It doesn't mean that they're separate, that
Mm-hmm.
to be political means to not be ethical. The idea is that politics has a very different kind of way of organizing and disciplining your activities than ethics does. Ethics is in some ways separate from reality because it's a belief I can have, it's a thought I can have, it's a principle, but it's an abstraction. And
Right.
Marx's idea, following Hegel, is always to make what was rational real, to make it to it objectified in the world. And I
Right.
think that requires a kind of realism that Marx knew was necessary. And that's the kind of realism that I think is lacking today. So you could take Black Lives Matter as an example. It's been reduced by necessity, but also through, I think, bad theory, to the idea it's like this is police. It's not just police violence, but just organized violence against Black bodies, which
Mm-hmm.
is an empirical truth at one layer. But in order to understand that, and that truth requires a kind of understanding of a system where I want dignity, I want equality, I want to be treated as anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
But the truth of the matter is that if you look at the ways that capital accumulation, real estate, the way that society, and in North America, which is essentially an apartheid society, has divided racial groups apart, you realize that in order to make something like that happen is going to require a kind of some redistributive mechanism within the class structure of society itself that that the kind of racism we have today is tied to the kind of separateness that class allows, facilitates.
Mhm.
And there's no, I mean, there's, from what I can see, almost no discussion of this. But this is essentially where a lot of those movements from the 1960s ended up in the 1970s, realizing 10 to 12 years after 1968 that they were going to have to challenge the power of states, and the state of New Jersey is an example, just to give you a kind of historical example.
Uh-huh.
Social movements in the 60s, after the civil rights movement and after its more radicalization, um, uh, for racial equality and racial justice, finally those movements end up maturing in the 1970s and pressing for more and more equality. But they said, well, school busing is not going to work. I shouldn't have to take my children from where they live and bus them into another community. That's not really going to solve the problem. And it's actually, frankly, still racist, because it's like, I don't want to live with these people, but their kids can go to school with my kids. The real question, the real answer, policy answer became, you're going to have to integrate these communities. You're going to have to take what were ghettos, and you're going to have to depopulate them and move people into the more affluent suburbs and mix people to have a truly socially, a sense of social equality that people can grow up with, in a kind of common space.
Mhm.
And this was challenged in court. This went up to the Supreme Court in New Jersey. It's a very famous case called the Mount Laurel decision, where they basically reversed this and kept the status quo, which you still see now. And so now, for example, the university where I teach in New Jersey is uh, literally, you can go from 3 miles into the center of Paterson, New Jersey, where the standard of quality of life and is extremely low. 3 miles over into Bergen County, New Jersey, in a town such as like Ridgewood, which is one of the most affluent towns in the world that the human species has ever enjoyed. You have
Mhm.
students you have two completely different communities living side by side in effectively an apartheid situation, racially almost completely separate, class-wise, cultural capital, social, the whole thing. And the Black Lives Matter, obviously, is, as I said, as an ethical position, that violence and exclusion and marginalization has to stop. We're sick of it. We're done with it. And we focus it on police brutality because that's the thin edge of the wedge. That's when it really hits you. But there's all this other stuff that's there that's going to make this problem come back. And I think that's one of the ideas that Marx is talking about, that you have to see that there's a real structure, a material structure that makes these symptoms emerge and reemerge, that it's not just purely racism, that racism in America in particular has its roots in the nature of capital accumulation and also the nature of who gets integrated into that and who does not.
Okay. This is okay. So let's get into the book itself and the title. Uh, all these issues are extremely interesting, and I want to take up a lot of the points, but we'll fold it into the book. So I guess the first question is, what is democratic socialism by your definition? Because there are many definitions, and why do you refer to it as an inheritance for our times?
So the title actually comes from a book by the German philosopher Ernst Bloch, um, which this is my kind of translation of the title. And Ernst Bloch's kind of philosophy, to crudely boil it down, was the idea that there's this human project for um, emancipation, for hope, and utopia performs a very important function in this, that the ability to think differently from the reality principle of the world that you live in is the true engine throughout human history of how human progress actually takes place. So the inheritance for our times was the idea that said, look, we're living in a world politically, culturally, socially, where increasingly defined by what Mark Fisher, in his great book Capitalist Realism, defines as this idea of capitalist realism, that there's no alternative, that this is it. All your hopes, all your dreams about, as an individual, but also about what kind of a society you want to live in, it's all here. It's all pre-programmed. Democratic socialism, therefore, is this idea that's an inheritance for our times, really means that we're at a moment where people are becoming interested in the concept of socialism again. They're becoming more and more aware of the injustice of capitalism as an economic system, as a social system, embedded in culture. And they're becoming more and more aware of the kind of alienation that afflicts them. And so, in the sense that it's for our times, it was probably for all time since capitalism really emerged. But there's a particular interest now that wasn't there, say 20 to 30 to 40 years ago. And so this book, in many ways, is a kind of way to say tap back into that combination of that kind of humanistic strain, the humanistic principles and hopes that the socialist movement always had, as a kind of cultural project and project for humanity, but also to talk about the hard facts of politics and what kind of policies and programs fit with the kind of dilemmas for our age. And so democratic socialism, in this respect, is a kind of way of organizing society for the common interest, for the common good, but a common good which has as its purpose the emancipation and freedom and fulfillment and self-development of each individual within that society. And so that's how we see this concept as a kind of macro principled idea of what the theoretical orientation of democratic socialism is.
So would I be right in understanding what you're saying there as basically you're putting socialism into its proper context of the Enlightenment itself?
Yes.
Rather than as many, like during the Cold War, for example, would have seen it as, opposite to the Enlightenment tradition, as as alien. Okay, right.
Well,
So,
can I say something about that? Because that's just something really important. The idea of the Enlightenment as a kind of singular thing is, I think, what is really at issue.
Yeah.
Marx is a product of the Enlightenment, but he's also a critic of its more immature and early manifestations. I mean, one would never say that Adam Smith, for example, is not an Enlightenment thinker, or Ferguson, or any of these people who would have supported the idea of the market or anything. The real key seems to me to turn around what happens after the French Revolution and what that does to European thought. That effectively there is this split that occurs between people of the Enlightenment, and it kind of goes in three different directions. There are people who seek to uphold liberalism, kind of a form of democratic liberalism, as a project, slowly democratizing society, but holding on to the idea of a kind of capitalist private, a market system. A second is purely reactionary, that the excesses of the French Revolution mean that democracy is untenable and you have to go back to tradition. And the third is the idea that says, yeah, we want more democracy, and we not just to democratize the political sphere, but the entirety of society. That basically what liberalism does is leave out the economic sphere from the principles of democracy, whereas socialism, I think, maintains that democracy has to be a total phenomenon, that every form of power within society has to be accountable to the common interest, to the public interest. And that's something that capitalist societies today basically withhold. So Marx is looking back to ancient Greece, but he's also looking to modernity. There's this kind of synthesis there. Hegel's doing something similar. So I think it's like this idea
And then,
that,
if you
yeah,
don't
go ahead.
mind, I mean, people make this artificial distinction. I mean, Marx was reading Spencer, he was reading Ricardo, he was reading Adam Smith. I mean, there was not a huge difference in terms of the problems they were addressing. He just had a very different solution, but he regularly referred to all these thinkers at the time. Darwin, of course. I mean,
Yeah.
all the mainstream and most important thinkers of the time. So he was part of the mix and not an outsider.
There's a part of the mix, and a crucial part of the mix, because what Marx is able to see, obviously, that Ricardo and Hegel and Smith, etc., could never have seen, which is the historical appearance of capital as a socially organized form of reality, that the industrial world is a unique expression of a new form of power. And it's this idea that shows why history is such an important variable in understanding ethics or development of human change and emancipation. There's no way that Adam Smith, I mean, it makes perfect sense if you read Smith during his time, given the world that he lived in, or Hegel's justification of the market and his philosophy of right. And you could say to yourself, well, it doesn't sound so bad to have a baker and a candlestick
Mhm.
maker and a butcher, and everyone's basically roughly equal. And yeah, it's great to have a baker. It's great to have this. What's the problem? The problem is they couldn't understand what capital was. They couldn't
Mhm.
understand a technologically organized, concentrated. I mean, you think about the transformation of technology, for example, from say the 1800 to when Marx is writing in the 1840s, uh, getting ready to write the manifesto. Technology for all of human history was a personal, it was a feature of an individual. You would carry your axe with you, your scythe, even like Pascal's machinery for computing numbers. This was something that was for you. It was an extension of one of your capacities,
Mhm.
your arms or your mind or your ability to calculate. It's only really in Manchester, that technology becomes a social reality, that
Yeah.
plant and industry becomes necessary. And this is what Marx is grasping at with capital. It's a process. And that's nothing that anyone before him could have seen. It's just not possible. So I think that this is why Marx is working in a new space, because the neoliberal reaction to the social democratic social contract that emerged out of World War II in Western capitalist societies, the neoliberalism reaction to that was basically to reach back before capital's emergence for philosophical and theoretical justification for the market. If it's as sophisticated as Hayek tries to make things out to be, it's effectively, there's nobody really talks about capital as a fundamental way, the fundamental way that Marx does. So
Yeah.
reaching back to Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations was a big thing to do for neoliberals. Um, is a kind of intellectual sleight of hand, and it works as an ideological justification. And I think that's why Marx's idea of what socialism is so powerful, or communism in his vision, because I really think he saw it as a kind of modernization of that ideal of what, say, the most democratic of the Greek polis would have been in antiquity, but harnessing all of the powers of the Enlightenment capacities for technology to emancipate people from needless toil. I mean, that's the kind of utopian moment within Marxism. But I do think it's important to point that out, because democratic socialism is distinct. It's not an outgrowth of liberalism. It's not an outgrowth of welfare statism. It's not an outgrowth of social democracy. A democratic socialism is a distinct political theory, social theory, and historical tradition.
Okay, that's interesting in terms of you even distinguishing it from social democracy, which in fact, I mean, Marx was a member of the Social Democratic Party of Germany, wasn't he?
Yes.
Right, right. Um, so I suppose there's a number of things I'd maybe ask you to differentiate it from, and you can take off from there, because you mentioned the post World War II welfare state, which a lot of people who call themselves democratic socialists in America would hark back to and look at the taxation rates and things like that. And you have made allusion to it. I don't know, do you see that as a kind of proto-democratic socialism or democratic socialism itself? And if so, or if not, what is the difference between welfare statism and democratic socialism?
Well, I think that with in welfare statism, there's the assumption that the classes come to some kind of new social contract or agreement, that
Mhm.
capital and labor and other sectors of society basically agree on the terms of the game, but a little bit more equality and expansion for, say, opportunity and public goods. Is that an improvement over what we have now? Yes, it is. But the problem really is, and this is where a Marxian analysis becomes salient, is that in the United States and England, for example, the the social democratic social contract was forced on onto capital, uh, while allowing capital to still remain in private control. I
Mhm.
think the architects of this system said this is they've got no choice. They're afraid of the extremes. They saw the early 20th century. They're afraid of Bolshevism, and they're
Mhm.
afraid of fascism. And so we've seen from the vantage point of, say, 1948, you can see what happened in the world over the past 50 years. We let capitalism run amok. We let it grind people's lives up into nothing. We let speculation run rampant and destroyed society. It led to all these political problems and war, and it's a disaster. It has to stop. The problem is that capital has, as Marx pointed out, capital has its own logic. It does not want to share itself with anyone. So it's not until the 1970s that capital really got fed up with the welfare state itself. In effect, the capitalist class was sick of funding the social democratic welfare state. So the one theory about inflationary problems and pressures of the 1970s, and this is something that conservatives and liberals always look to as a kind of, this is the gotcha moment for, say, a more democratic form of socialism, is the idea that, the welfare state led to these bloated budgets.
Mhm.
It led to inflation, out of control inflation, and by 1978, 79, it was out of control, and you needed a Reagan or a Thatcher to come in and discipline the excesses. It was, basically allowing the candy store to be free.
Mhm.
And the problem is when you look at this political, from a kind of data perspective, the theory doesn't fit the empirical facts. That really what happens. I mean, to make the discussion as simple as possible,
Mhm.
is the reason that the inflation rate went up is that capital basically went on an investment strike. They said, if we're not going to be making the same, we're not going to get the same returns that we would have gotten back in 1925, and you know uh, reason we got into this whole game in the first place. Then we're just going to spend it on yachts and homes, and we're just going to be rich people. And we're not going to invest our money because every time we invest it, it gets taxed at a 78% rate or an 80% rate. So there's no incentive for us to invest.
Mhm.
So instead, countries like the United States had to go off the gold standard and print money in order to meet their welfare payment obligations in the form
Right.
of public education, in the form of roads, in the form of everything that the social welfare state which was actually the cause of the and of course fighting wars like Vietnam,
Mhm.
which bankrupted the state. So you have to print money for your imperialist enterprise on the one hand, but also to shore up the social democratic social contract because you're afraid of that fraying. Meanwhile, capital says, the rich basically say, well, we're sick of funding this. We don't want anything to do with it anymore. And you end up in this kind of spiral. And I think the reason that I'm bringing this up as an example is you can see that it's only about 25 years after the social democratic social contract is kind of created in the United States and England
Mm-hmm.
also, that you can see the class tensions were always there, and
Right.
that 1980 really represents this reactionary counter revolt against that social democratic. So the thing is, so the idea of that it can teach us a lot of lessons about the power of what the state can do when it's democratized, when it's oriented toward common interests, when it is confident in its redistributive and ameliorative powers. Um, and there's a lot in terms of concretely moving forward in terms of what socialist policies should look like. It can teach us a lot. But one thing remains crucial, I believe, is that, and this is the real radical moment. This is where you make the, kind of cross the Rubicon.
Mm-hmm.
Um, is that, and Marx and Engels say this in the manifesto as a basic principle, that no one should ever be able to accumulate enough property that they could control the labor of another person.
Right.
As long as that is allowed, then it's like holding the wolf by the ears. It's just a matter of time that you may be able to hold it down. Jefferson said about slavery, it's like holding the wolf by the ears.
Right.
And it's not right, but there's going to be a time when you have to deal with this problem. And I think that's exactly what we're dealing with now.
Well, that's interesting. And I've got to say, your analysis of the sort of rise of Reagan and Thatcher, that's interesting because I've normally put it back to the delinking of the dollar from gold, and then inflation rates going out of control and financial capitalism going wild and whatnot with all this speculation. But you push it back a little, which is interesting, that the reason why that emancipation or delinking had to happen there in 71 was because of the strike of capital. That's interesting. That's interesting. And it's part of a kind of a class analysis of history, which is important, that Marxism gives. So this is interesting. So and you've said earlier that the difference between democratic liberalism, let's say, and if you want to put it that way, and democratic socialism is sort of the liberalism's lack of focus on economics and more individual rights, and whereas socialism brings in the economic aspect. Now, from what you were describing just now about democratic socialism, and it's the goal, I suppose, as you see it, to prevent the excessive accumulation of private property power, or private property itself, which I suppose inherently has that power. I mean, that sounds hardly different from communism. So what is the difference then?
So these are all soft categories, I think, that never
Yeah.
really had a true articulation. One I think difference that, and this is, I mentioned the kind of splits that occurred after the French Revolution. Another series of important fractures and shifts and splits, ideologically and politically, obviously occur after 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And one of the things that also reasons that we were intent on emphasizing the idea of democratic socialism was also as a way of pushing back against the kind of rising romanticization, I think, of Leninism and Bolshevism that has emerged in the left, in particular in the United States,
Mm-hmm.
with younger people. A crucial part of what democratic socialism is, and this is its real rootedness in the Enlightenment, is the idea of a republic that it's rooted in rule of law, that is rooted in some form of constitutionalism, some form of equal rights for everyone. That these kind of fundamental ideas that really emerged out of the 18th century are not to be seen as bourgeois claptrap and ideology, but these are absolutely fundamental for a truly democratic society. So
Okay.
I think that that's a big big role to say that, okay, if we have to slap labels on things, I don't know if, I mean, in truth, when you read what Marx is talking about with communism, the more he talks about what communism could be, the more abstract it gets. Marx's power, I believe, is in diagnostic critical, that to show that, well, in his early writings, that there's this new way of thinking about what human beings are, and they can be alienated from that kind of human essence that we've lost. But
Mhm.
also the idea that communism harks back, to my mind and my interpretation, um, a similar root to the word socialism harks back to. That communism harks back to the idea of what is common interest, common good, which was central to classical political theory, just as socialism is rooted in the Latin word for fellows, socii,
Mhm.
the idea that we are equals in this robust way, not only in terms of economic interests, but in a robust way, that we are part of a common enterprise. We are interdependent beings. And I think that this is really where democratic socialism, well, if you think about communism, what communism really represented as a political tradition and an institutional set of actually existing communism, um, it's a complete nightmare in
Right.
comparison to what you would want a truly
Yeah.
democratic society to be. So if communism has to go, if the word has to go down with that kind of, you know, that's its association with that political reality, then so be it. But socialism, as I see it, socialism really is asking us to stay away from any kind of romanticization of kind of some kind of Bolshevism, and I'm talking about even pre-Stalinistic Bolshevism,
Yeah.
um, but also to stay away from the idea that liberalism is kind of the same thing. That
Right.
again, that this is a distinct tradition.
So you are definitely um, seeing democratic socialism as a sort of authentic Marxism. That's what it sounds like to me.
An authentic expression of a tradition that really reemerges during the Italian Renaissance,
Right.
which is of radical republicanism.
Right.
The idea of going from Machiavelli through people like some theorists of the English Civil War, like Harrington and others, passed down to people like Rousseau, and then inevitably seeded into the ideas of Marx. It's a structure
Right.
of thought that that is very powerful because, and I'll tell you why it's so important to really, and it's going to take a lot more work to bring this back out into focus, in terms of scholarship and ideas, but because liberalism really was the reaction to republicanism. Liberalism in France is a reaction to the what they saw as the excesses of republicanism during the
Right.
French Revolution. So we're still operating, even though there's a change in historical circumstance, from a kind of theoretical standpoint, we're still operating within the same tensions within that structure of thought that's been passed down to us. So I
Right.
see democratic socialism, as do I think many of the contributors to the volume, but I see democratic socialism as heir to a kind of radical Republican way of thinking.
Hmm. But definitely rooted in Marx. Correct.
With no question, because Marx
Yeah.
is the one who was able to, again, as I said before, if you're Machiavelli, you can just theorize about a city
Yeah.
and talk about the. Marx makes the crucial move that he can understand the logic of
Yeah.
capital.
Because there is, I suppose, a tradition of non-Marxist socialism,
Mhm.
like Owenitism
Yes,
and that type of stuff, diggers, levelers, and
right.
whatnot. And in fact, in its practical manifestations, now if we get into the realm of actual politics, like for instance here in the Caribbean, um, Michael Manley in Jamaica, you know, they called their movement democratic socialist, and it was to differentiate themselves from Cuba and later on Grenada, which in
Mhm.
1979, but and because Manley was 72, it preceded Grenada, and they meant to say more or less that people there would be multi-party elections, there would be elections in and of themselves. Other parties were allowed; they weren't going to expropriate private property. But they were they were going to make the economy much more accountable to the people, and they were also going to fight for a new international economic order in global capitalism. So democratic socialism in this particular context here, which really dominates so much of our historical thinking in this area, it part of it was sort of issuing Marxism too, because there was a hardcore communist Marxist group in Jamaica, and in fact, I mean, I know a lot of these people personally. I studied with them because they were based at the university. But it's very interesting. But it sounds a bit so. So I guess it would bring me to this, and to bring it back to the book as well. So I mean, so you have a very specific definition, well articulated, well justified and argued view of what democratic socialism is, and etc. But there are other views as well. And so let's say in the book itself, I know you have an essay there about the three, sorry, what did you call it? The three arms or the three spheres of,
Yes.
of democratic socialism. But the other contributors to the book, are there significant differences between you all?
I think I didn't. I mean, as I was collating, as we were, Greg, my co-editor, and I were collating the essays, and I was reading through them. I wasn't able to find anyone that was in any way at variance with the
Right.
kind of principles that I laid out. What we thought was really important about doing this as an edited volume, as opposed to some kind of manifesto kind of thing, was to show that it's only through collaborative thinking that a more robust kind of idea about the potentialities of what democratic socialism can actually be. That to come out of the mind of one person is just anathema to the enterprise. And I think that what I really liked about the other essays in the volume is how other people were able to reach into sometimes concrete policy ideas, such as different ideas about banking and public finance, whereas others were able to reach back into, say, recent intellectual history and talk about certain figures who were trying to talk about socialism and its relationship to like homosexuality and gay rights, for
Mm-hmm.
example. And this idea that these seemingly diverse or divergent layers of interest, which in academia would have been separated and spread out into different divisions of labor within the academy, are brought together in a volume, shows the multifaceted way that we can start rethinking the ways that a market-based, economy, narcissistically organized culture thinks about what's possible. And the idea that any one of these essays could spark something, or an awareness or an idea of what's potential, is, I think, crucial. What we asked each person to do was not only lay out a kind of principled position, but also to show how there is some practical kind of hook in reality that we can say this is something that we can do. Some of those things are large. I mean, a massive public financing system would take decades to actually set up, but the idea that these things are on the level of the possible, not the level of fantasy, but
Yeah.
the level of possibility. We wanted to connect principle and practice, and I think that's really why the different essays, even though they're about many different things, are really not divergent at all in terms of where we're coming from.
Right. I mean, and when you look at it's like 44 different chapters. So I guess, is it 44 contributors? Um,
Yeah, there's a couple that
roughly.
were co-authored,
Yeah. So it could be even more. Yeah.
but there's 30 chapters as a whole.
Right. Right. And I mean, it's some deal with theory. I mean, we've been talking about
Yes.
theory a lot here, but some deal with well, I guess is another theoretical aspect, the relationship of democracy and socialism. But then things like relationships to other struggles, such as feminism
Right.
or anarchism or anti-racism or environmentalism, the Occupy movement you talked about, and market socialism, anti-work, all this kind of stuff. I find this. I suppose I'm coming back to the theory part of it. I find it interesting too, because of your situating democratic socialism firmly within the Enlightenment now, and the whole Lacan-Mouffe post-Marxism, which embraced a lot of the postmodern critique of the Enlightenment itself, right? So a lot of the critique of the Enlightenment itself then translates to a critique of Marxism, and Marxism becomes equated with Western Enlightenment, right? Like so,
That's
a
right.
la Foucault and
Right.
and whatnot. So, and a lot of these other struggles are very much informed, well, as they exist or as they're theorized, not necessarily in the book, but in general, very much informed by postmodernism and the critique of the Enlightenment. So, so how do you deal with that tension there? And the various authors deal with them. Yeah.
Well, there's a kind of common stance here with this. I think if you think of thinkers like Foucault and Lacan-Mouffe, I really, I think these are thinkers that, as intriguing and intellectually engaging as they are, have done more damage for left political struggles than they've helped. And I'll tell you, there's an idea that power has no center. The idea that everything's inscribed in our kind of biopolitics, or the ways that we live, and these mentalities and ways of thinking. It's just as elegant as it is. It's ultimately just wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, from the Marxian perspective, the idea is obviously there are aspects of power that are kind of pre-capitalist that are still folded up in our culture, in our world. But the idea is, again, the critique of capital is important only because capitalism, capitalist society, reproduces the same kind of power dynamics that were seen as deformative to a truly robustly human and freedom-enhancing form of community and culture and society. That the idea that what lurks behind all the ideology of the market and capital is always going to be blood. It's always going to be on some level, whether it's of nature, of other human beings, that you just have to remember that capital is the organizing principle. There are people who control capital. There are people who make decisions. And the more oligarchical our society, our world, our global society becomes, the more amplified the power of those people become. That the ability for bureaucracies and new institutions and new cultural ways of thinking almost always have their root back into who owns the ability to control the means of communication, the means of production, the means of distribution. In other words, the capitalist class. And the idea that this is some grand conspiracy theory is absurd. And the idea that power is just out there everywhere in everything we do, it's just not really a profound political argument to make.
Yeah,
to me, this just doesn't help.
I think that like it's people having lived through that shift from of the left from being basically Marxist to Foucauldian. Or even for a while it was kind of Nietzschean, but it was really Nietzsche through Foucault. It was just like a pretend Nietzscheanism, as far as I'm concerned.
That's right.
Because Nietzsche was not a nihilist. Foucault is.
Foucault is. Yeah.
He did emerge in the 70s against the French communists. I mean, against Althusser, against
Right.
all of them were anti-Marxist. All of them were anti, and the Marxists and the left recognized the postmodernist movement as being reactionary, and but that somehow in the 80s or 90s somewhere it got forgotten, and now someone like Jordan Peterson can just blithely equate postmodernism and Marxism, where
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
that's very strange, and so your book then, I suppose, and the contributors who deal with these other issues that have been so informed now by postmodern critique, I suppose are engaging in that sort of debate, are they,
Well, it's a
in dealing
constant
with these issues?
it's a constant struggle, because I think whereas in the 80s and 90s it was still theory,
Yeah.
now it's full-blooded practice.
Mm-hmm.
And in the movements that are emerging now, with that come out of the millennial and I guess Generation Y, whatever they're calling these cohorts now,
Yeah,
the reality is that all of their dissent has been essentially commodified.
that's right.
It's all captured by the market. I think I saw it was last
There's a
week that
T-shirt for everything.
there's a T-shirt for everything. Well, even like I think it was the corporation. The United States, there's a chain of they yoga clothes and yoga studios called Lululemon. It's a multi-billion-dollar corporation.
Right.
They have anti-capitalist
Yeah.
yoga seminars now. I mean,
Mhm.
this is chic
Yeah.
now. And so when you frame it this way, and some of the most successful, you know, young people on the left, it's seen as hip, it's seen as cool, because it's non-threatening,
That's right.
precisely because they don't know what they're talking about. And we found we were really frustrated at this, because if they're it, the idea that and Marx says this in one of the prefaces to Capital, that you can talk about almost anything in common, in polite society or in society in general. Once you move toward the idea of the redistribution of property, that's when they call the police on you. That's the moment when the bourgeoisie will tolerate almost any kind of discussion about sexuality, about racial equality, but anything that actually deals with the actual core material resource of power in society is a non-starter. And I think that Foucault's and all of the kind of cascading people who followed Foucault and kind of
Hmm.
amplified the theory to make it into what's sexy, um, really have done so much damage to not just Marxist theory and Marxism, but to the consciousness of what it means to oppose power. And
Right.
that's the worst. I mean, if you were someone like Marx, you had the French Revolution in distant memory, and still cultural collective memory. It was still there, and that was rooted in previous revolution, and that's rooted in kind of overthrowing of the medieval world and feudalism, and that's rooted in in kind of Greek democracy. They become increasingly romantic the more you go back in time, but now there's been a cutoff.
Yeah.
Now it's as if these people are emerging from a sleep, but they've been given a script that is going to make them almost by nature. Whatever opposition you have to the system has already been incorporated into it. And by the way, if I may say,
Mm.
actually, this was precisely the conscious design of 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 what a kind of progressive era in the United States was called the progressive era
Yeah.
was meant to achieve. And it was in 1901 or 1900. Um, um, a really important progressive thinker writes an essay that ends. He says that moderate redistribution of property, some more lightening up on cultural attitudes, will reconcile everybody
Right.
to the current system. And it's been 120 years since, and it's a rocky road, but that's effectively what's happened. And again, just to bring it back to the kind of movements that are happening now, um, you know, it's frustrating to see that when you really have real injustices, such as what you see in particular in the United States, with the type of racism we have, the type of racial apartheid we have, and the way that that resonates with other forms of social justice, injustice, that this is not an opportunity for a broader, critical, and radical kind of space of thinking. That really is telling me that the radical imagination has been seriously constrained.
Right, right. So, well, that brings us to the question of where do you see democratic socialism going? Because I want to put that question in the context of, because one, there's a lack of clarity as to what it means, and people are embracing the term democratic socialism, but they may mean something very different from what you mean, for
Yeah,
example, and what
yeah, yeah,
contributors
yeah.
mean. And then the Democratic Party as being part of that, being identified with it, but I suspect you don't see it as carrying that tradition. So where do you see it going?
So the only real possibility for true redemocratization of society has to come from new forms of organization and new forms of kind of bottom up forms of power. And that means rethinking what the unionization movement uh, means. The successful paradigm for unionization, what was accepted by the liberal social democratic social contract, was a form of trade unionism, which was essentially just protecting different sectors of the labor force. That's almost been completely wiped out. The new a new form of organization has to move forward, which protects people as wage earners rather than, say, plumbers or electricians. That there have to be these um, um, you have to return to the idea of the power of the strike, the power of solidarity, and the power of organization. Only then, I think, can you start to think about higher forms of power and transition, and higher forms of, say, retooling the actual institutions that exist. In particular, one thing that I've been kind of pushing for as an idea is some kind of constitutional amendment that would, or some kind of capital accountability act, for example.
Okay.
Um, this would be an idea of how you can insert within the structure. But at the same time, all of these kind of political changes require not elites to make those changes, but rather movements from the bottom rising up with articulate demands. One of the great things about the manifesto is, how it goes through this whole global world history of capitalism and then into socialism, but then ends with a set of 10 concrete demands
Yeah.
for what the Communist Party wants. I think you need something similar to this. You need to have a vision about what's going on in your world. Of what you have to have a description, a critical diagnostic description of what's happening in your world, but you also have to have a kind of vision about what you want, and then you have to have a concrete set of these are things that'll get us started
Yeah.
into making these incremental changes, and um, it's a tall order. It's always been a tall order.
Hmm.
But the further, I think we're walking into a world where um, the inequality is going to be so extreme, the nature of work is going to become so much more alienated that only a kind of really dystopian future will be able to sustain it. A world where people really have no need for connectedness to anyone,
Right.
a world where people are truly anomic and atomized.
Yeah.
And even though I see that as a kind of phase of society that society might have to go through, there's always going to be that moment where people say, I don't want this anymore.
Yeah.
And at that moment, they're going to have to reach for this idea that says we have to organize, we have to come together in solidarity. And that's going to require looking back to the past and see how did the Austrians, in uh, after World War I, actually create a socialist municipality in Vienna?
Mm-hmm.
How did radical parties do this in northern Italy? How did they do this there? And then get interest in this again, in these principles and the ideas and these movements. But it has to start from a kind of reorganization, I believe, of of working life. That people who work, whether they're at restaurants or whether they drive taxis and Ubers, that there has to be a new class consciousness that emerges. If that can't happen, or if that's frustrated, or there's a further way that leftist movements just don't get it, then this what we have now is just going to persist.
Right, right. I mean, the book has, so each, as part of your vision of what democratic socialism is and means, and uh, you yourself, as you've emphasized throughout this interview, and I mean the authors in the book, try to marry theory and practice. A few of the most of the contributors are, university lecturers and whatnot, but some of them are activists on the ground. And
Yeah,
one of the your most high profile contributor is Bernie Sanders.
right.
So why don't you give a little reflection on his contribution to the book, but also his role in this whole movement as well, as you understand it.
I think Bernie Sanders' role in the movement has been absolutely crucial because he's been able, and I think his essay in the volume is really great because he does link up um, he does propose the idea that America, first of all, America, people in the United States should not be afraid of socialism. That this was kind of a flavor of where American political culture has always been. That there's always been this kind of thread there. But most importantly, to look back to what we really just recently had. That if that social democratic social contract is seen not so much as a kind of way of thwarting more progressive change, which is how some on the ultra left really see it, a way of shutting people up and just reconciling them to the system, but rather what it actually was, which is that it set the stage for an affluent society, affluent middle class society that began to question other forms of inequality and injustice, like race, like sexuality, like gender. It led to the 1960s, to alternative ways of non commodified life, new ideas about sexuality. And into the 1970s, when movements were really pushing for expansion of the welfare state and actually really toward ideas about real socialization of, of private capital for public purposes. And he said, look back to this and look at, say, 1980s as a moment of reaction that we've been asked to live in ever since. And I think that that's really important, that each country has its own kind of movements, its own past that it can pick back up on, hook back into for energy and ideas. And Bernie Sanders' campaign, both of his campaigns, really put this stuff back onto the agenda. I mean, Occupy Wall Street did for sure. The idea of the 1% versus the 99%. That was a radical new change in terms of the kind of public sphere about how we were talking about inequality. But Bernie Sanders really um, did more than anyone else to really make people talk about the word socialism in a way that before you couldn't talk about it here.
Mm-hmm.
In a way that it was like, well, that made people curious. Well, what really are we talking about? And it made this book possible in many ways because before Bernie Sanders, there just would have been no public acceptance. This would have been just another fringe idea, and he's changed that conversation here.
Right, right. So, what message would you like to leave your readers with after they read through all the various contributions and so forth? What would you like them to take away?
I think two things. I think, first of all, that principled opposition to power is still possible. That thinking about a world um, that can be better than it is now is possible. And that many different contributors show that there are many different individuals or movements throughout history that really made a difference. And if you're reading this alone somewhere and you look at the news and see how terrible things are, you have to see that things have been worse for other people in the past. And there's always going to be that moment that you have to keep that alive. But secondly, to show that there are all these different kind of ways that socialism can emerge within life, that it's a principle that can take on many, many different forms and shapes in terms of the banking system, in terms of our relations racially with other people, in terms of sexuality, that it really, and the environment and nature, in a global sense as well as domestic and local, and to rethink and reframe the world from the reified way, really, that we've been all taught to think in lockstep with in terms of this capitalistic globalization. And I think if people can come away with just this idea that democratic socialism is something that you are rather than something that exists outside of you,
Mm-hmm.
that you are a democratic socialist, that you have to process the world in terms of thinking about power in a new way, thinking about freedom and justice and solidarity in a new way, the common interest and the common good in a new way. That if there's enough people that undergo that transformation in terms of their own thought processes and ethical frame, then you've got the seeds for a new movement.
Great, great. Are you working on any other projects right now that you'd like our listeners to know about?
I have a book coming out in November, which is a kind of an attempt to uh, kind of create a new kind of ethical framework um, for thinking about the common interest and justice and freedom, called The Spectre of Babel.
Okay.
And that's going to be out in November. And also, if readers are interested, I founded a journal about 18 years ago called Logos, a Journal of Modern Society and Culture, and
Okay.
we publish quarterly at logosjournal.com, and we publish a lot of this articles on these themes and explore how they apply in other parts of political and cultural life.
All right. Well, that's very interesting. And so, where can they check out the journal?
It's at www.logosjournal.com.
Okay. Excellent. Well, thanks so much for this interview, Michael.
Thank you, Kirk. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been very thought-provoking and stimulating. So
Thank you.
once again, the book is An Inheritance for Our Times. The Principles and Politics of Democratic Socialism, published by OR Books. And we've been speaking to a co-editor, Mark Thompson. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Kirk.
And thank you also to you, our listeners. I look forward to seeing you on the next episode. This has been New Books in Politics and Polemics on the New Books Network.